Hi everyone, thanks for joining the webinar today on the importance of ISOs in public sector frameworks. I'm Adam, Procurement Solutions Manager here at Thornton Lowe. I'm going to jump into the main topic shortly, but just to give you guys a bit of background into sort of who's on the webinar today and who's hosting for you. So we're Thornton Lowe, so we help suppliers grow through public sector tendering and strategy and marketing support. Reason for the webinar today really is that within this arena and through our experience through our long-term experiences in helping businesses achieve success in the public sector, we've become sort of more and more aware of how important it is from a bidding perspective for our clients to be achieving these key ISO certifications. So that's in terms of getting on public sector frameworks and then also winning work off the back of the frameworks. So that's the reason we're running the webinar today, really. So from my side, from the Thornton Lowe side, we're going to be talking about sort of why the ISO standards and certificates are important for public sector bidding, compliance-wise, which is a huge part of it, but also how to incorporate them into compelling bid responses as well and maximize your evaluation scores. I'm delighted to say we're also joined by Stacey and Ina from ISO QSL. So they'll be contributing to our webinar today a bit further on in the process. So you'll find out more shortly, but QSL essentially provide ISO certification services. So they'll be taking you through sort of the process for certification and how they can help suppliers who are looking to achieve the key ISOs. So as Chris mentioned, we'll run for about 30 or 40 minutes. It'll be super practical, full of examples and practical advice for you. And just as a quick reminder for any latecomers, if you drop your message drop any questions you have into the chat, we'll get to it. We'll get to as many questions as we can later. So just to set the scene a little bit in terms of what we're talking about in terms of public sector frameworks and ISO standards there. So with public sector frameworks, if you think of these essentially as approved supplier lists within the public sector, so these essentially allow public sector buyers to access goods and services from approved and compliant companies, essentially. So if you think of key authorities like the CCS, the NHS, and the government, so they are increasingly using frameworks as their preferred approach to procurement. And the main reason for that is that it's now sort of well understood that frameworks they really streamline the procurement process, both for suppliers and for buyers. So it's giving public sector buyers access to a large pool of pre-vetted suppliers without having to run multiple tender processes. And then within the sort of mini competition element, which comes once you're on the framework, that's maximizing healthy competition and best value between the suppliers as well. So some of you may be aware that to actually get on a framework to be successful, there'll be a competitive tendering process. So that'll be based on specific evaluation criteria that's set by the buyer. And importantly, this will include minimum standards and certain pass-fail requirements to actually, which must be met by the bidder in order to be approved on the framework. Once the framework is live, depending on how the framework's set up, contracts will then be awarded, normally through a mix of further competition and direct award. And we'll see how ISOs link into that later. So in terms of the ISO standards then and the certificates, so ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. So essentially they are the international standard setting body. And then in terms of the ISOs themselves, they essentially define what great looks like essentially for services, products and goods globally. So there's a key benefit there for customers and buyers, really. So with those ISOs sort of setting consistent performance standards and benchmarks across a range of industries, they're allowing customers to be reassured, really, of the safety, the reliability, and the quality of the services they're getting. So that's the benefit from the buyer side. So for suppliers, they're really acting as a gold standard and guidance on the best practices to adopt across a range of industries. So it helps to think of each standard as founded on the question, what's the best way of doing this for any particular service or product. And then just a quick note to say, you'll often find with some industries that ISO certification is considered essential, if not necessarily a legal requirement for some industries. So in the realm of providing medical devices, for example, there's an ISO 13485, which if you were bidding, you would typically need to have that to be compliant. So in terms of the actual certification then, so simply put, the certification is just proof from a third party that your management system complies with one of the internationally recognized ISO standards. So why then are ISOs so important for bidding on public sector frameworks? So I already touched upon how the public sector frameworks will set minimum compliance criteria and pass-fail requirements to become approved. So this leads us on to the first reason ISOs are so important for bidding on public sector frameworks. So basically many frameworks, although not all frameworks, many public sector frameworks will require bidders to hold specific ISO certifications, and that'll be set as a minimum sort of pass-fail requirement. Sometimes in order to bid, but more often it will need to be provided before the supplier can actually be awarded contracts on the framework. So we'll come on to which ISOs that applies to shortly. But practically speaking, that will usually just mean that you need to provide evidence of your ISO certification. So depending on the ITT instructions, it will either be as part of your submission, uploading it to the portal, or it will be required post-submission before any contracts can be awarded to you on the framework. So which certifications does that apply to then? So it will depend on the specific public sector framework and the buyer as well. In terms of what the customers actually want and need, it will depend on the specifics of the framework, and it will often depend on the framework whether it turns out to be mandatory or not. But I'm just going to quickly touch upon some of the most popular widely used ISO certifications. These are becoming sort of increasingly relevant and important to public sector buyers, and they can often be a factor of the minimum requirements when you're bidding. So ISO 9001 is probably one you're probably familiar with. So this is essentially the best known quality management standard in the world. It's basically a stamp of approval, essentially, to say that whatever services you provide are consistently meeting your customer requirements. So the benefits of being aligned to this standard for you as a business. So it's increasing your productivity, increasing efficiency, and also sort of maximizing customer service excellence. So that's increasingly leading to sort of better client retention and driving your sales as well. This ISO also acts as a good foundation for your business in setting up an integrated management system. Essentially, this is the ISO standard upon which many others are based. So that gives you like a foundation to implement and roll out other key standards, which are listed here as well. So the ISO 27001, that's also an incredibly important standard. So this covers information security, data protection and cybersecurity. So certification to this standard, that reassures public sector buyers that you have an information security management system in place, and that you're committed to protecting the privacy and the integrity of the buyer's data. ISO 45001, that's another important standard. So this is focusing on reducing workplace hazards, and it's essentially about how you make sure everyone gets home safely, really. So as you can probably imagine, this is an important one in the construction industry for works contracts, but it is important across the board, really. So having this in place is just a big sign that you have a health and safety management system in place that protects your employees' well-being and safety. And again, that's leading to other benefits like boosting staff morale, and demonstrating that you have a commitment to a well-being culture in place as well. So the ISO 14001, we'll get back to that shortly in another context. And then just to mention quickly as well, there's also, and I'm sure QSL will mention this as well, but there's a vast number of industry-specific ISOs beyond the above. And again, we've touched upon this, but in some cases, these will be considered essential potentially in your industry that you're operating in. So for example, the ISO 17100 there, that's recognized sort of around the world for setting the standards for quality translation services. So just to give you a bit of a sort of real life example, prove to you that I'm not exaggerating the importance of these ISOs to public sector buyers. This is a recent CCS framework, which was recently awarded to multiple suppliers for office-based supplies and solutions. So as you can see in the slide here, CCS has named these specific certifications as mandatory. So they're requiring suppliers to have these essentially to be awarded onto the framework. So when it says award stage there under the evidence column, it's essentially saying that basically the CCS will have requested the certification as evidence from the buyers in the period after submission and before the framework is commenced. So during the tender stage, they'll likely have had to just self-certify during the tender process that they have these certifications and that they're able to provide them when requested. So the key point really practically around bidding here would be as part of your bid preparation, as part of assessing the tender documentation, just be clear on when you need to provide your certificate as evidence. So you may need to upload it with the submission and attach it to the portal to be compliant. Alternatively, you may just need to state within the tender that you'll provide this when requested post-submission. So we've talked about compliance and minimum standards, which is really important. But in the context of ISOs in public sector contracts and frameworks, it is about much more than compliance. So one obvious reason for that is that many public sector frameworks may not necessarily require the ISO certification as a minimum standard or to be awarded. But let's just say hypothetically that you're going for a public sector framework where it's not mandatory to have an ISO certification. This does not mean that the ISO certification and the standards are not important. The ISO certification is still important in those situations in a couple of different contexts. So firstly, in the context of actually applying and bidding for the framework, it's important to get on the framework. And then secondly, it's important in the context of the further competition that comes as a part of being on the framework. So what aspects of the bid are we talking about there in terms of when we say it can strengthen your bids? we're not necessarily talking about the pricing element, as the ISO certification doesn't necessarily help you there. What we're talking about really is the quality evaluation of your bid. And this can often form up to sort of anything between 50 to 70% of your overall score for public sector bids. So how then do ISOs strengthen your bid and increase your quality score? So the first thing to mention is competitiveness and how these give you a competitive edge for bids. So it's worth delving into this a little more closely, really. So always remember, when in the context of tendering in the public sector, you are competing against other bidders, and it can be easy to forget that occasionally. And this is not just in the context of the mini competitions for contracts when you're on the framework, but in actually applying for the framework as well. So if you think about the tender process to actually get approved on a framework, depending how the framework is set up, scoring higher than your competitors is always something you want to do, basically. So in some instances, that may actually lead to you being priority on the framework for direct award when the framework goes live. So in some instances, that's actually going to increase your share of the contract value off the back of the framework, purely just from scoring higher than some of your competitors. And then the next aspect of it is obviously when you're on the framework and you're going for mini competitions where you're up against other bidders, who are likely to be your competitors naturally, you could gain a competitive edge by having an ISO certification your competitor doesn't have. So in terms of giving you sort of like a practical example of how you would have that competitive edge, let's say that all bidders, for example, are faced with an environmental sustainability method statement. So let's say you need to write a response about your processes to monitor and manage your impact on the environment and reduce carbon. In this context, let's say you have the ISO 14001 certification, and one of your competitors doesn't, for example. In simple terms, you're very likely going to just score higher on this response. So you might score a 4 out of 5 compared to a 3 out of 5, for example, in simple terms. So the next point is just around quality. So this isn't just the case when we're talking about ISO 9001, but essentially all ISO certifications are suggestive of quality and consistency and customer service excellence. And again, linking back to the point around credibility, it's essentially proof to the evaluator and the buyer that you provide a consistent and reliable service. And then another key point, which is probably as important as the competitive edge element, is around evidence. So let's say you've got a typical process-based response in a construction tender, for example. So you might be asked to describe and evidence your quality management system and your processes for quality control. So this is where you'd want to be talking about the ISO 9001, essentially. Now you can be a really good bid writer, and you can still write a strong response around how your processes and procedures are aligned to the standard. But actually having the ISO 9001 certificate itself, that legitimizes and evidences what you're claiming about the strength of your management systems and your processes, essentially. And the final thing to say would just be that bear in mind that evidence is often a feature of the evaluation criteria for scoring top marks in tenders. So you'll often see a buyer saying something like, to receive a 5 out of 5 response, bidders must provide evidence and examples to substantiate their methodology. And then finally, just as a bit of an added bonus, really, for some public sector bids, although it's not always the case, you may be exempt from having to provide additional evidence and answer responses if you hold key certifications. So that will just save you time and resources on your bid as well. And that's demonstrated with a quick example here. So, linking back to what we were talking about in terms of ISO as being more than just compliance. So, this is an example of a framework that's being run by the Health Trust Europe. So I think this is closed for submissions about a month ago. But this gives you a good example, really. So essentially, this question within the ITT is asking bidders whether or not they have the ISO 9001, and it's scoring it on a 0 or 5 basis. But the key thing to be aware of here is that it's not pass-fail, so they can still bid without it, essentially, for this framework. But they will simply score higher. They'll get the full 5 points if they can evidence the certificate. So anyone who doesn't have that certification in this bidding process is going to, the score is going to be hurt by that, but they're not necessarily going to be shot out of the evaluation process, if that makes sense. So how do you actually then incorporate your ISOs into compelling bid and method statement responses? So let's say you're in the perfect position of coming to a public sector bid with plenty of time to write your bid. You've not missed the deadline. Whether it's a framework application or a mini competition, let's say you've got the accreditations you need, you've got the ISO 9001 or the ISO 45001, whatever's crucial for your industry and your sector. How do you then incorporate that into a compelling bid? Well, the first thing to say really is, seems like an obvious point, but if you need to, make sure you do upload evidence of your certificate to the portal. So that should just come as part of your due diligence process when you're submitting your bid. But beyond that, what can you do within your responses? So the first thing I would say is don't take it as a given that the reader will and the evaluator will actually understand the implications and the benefits of the ISO certificates you hold. So when you sit down with a tender question in front of you and you're kind of planning out your responses, you should be considering really from the buyer's perspective, from the evaluator's perspective, what are you giving them by holding these certifications? So what are the benefits? What added value are you bringing? And what safeguards are you offering to the buyer and the framework customers by having that in place, essentially? So that the process for that really is building that into your content through your storyboarding and your answer planning. So when you're brainstorming and plotting out the key points that are going into your response, it's just making sure that's at the forefront of your response based on how many words you have to answer the question. And as a kind of final thought on that, I would also say, don't treat having the ISO certificate as an excuse not to write a detailed response as well. So if you have a response in front of you where you have 1,000 words to answer the response, you know that you can't just say, I've got the certificate, so I don't need to write a detailed response here. Make sure you do sort of give it your all. So a couple of examples then, just to show you how you might incorporate ISOs into a compelling bid response. So this is a quick example from a public sector IT bid. So this is a framework to a local authority framework to deliver managed services and IT support to schools. So you can see in the introduction to this section, the bidders bringing the ISOs to the forefront of the response really there. They're essentially showing off and bringing the visuals in to make it front and center to the response to bring those ISO certificates in there. The second section of the response here, this links back to what I was saying about being aware of the implications and the benefits of what you're offering. So this is essentially detailing out what the implications are for the framework customers. So it's clearly saying what benefits and added value the bidder is offering the framework customers by having that integrated management system in place. So they say the fact that our IMS is certified to these standards is demonstrating that our service is built upon the highest industry standards for quality, security, and IT service management. So obviously in this case, a key benefit for the bidder is that they've got that industry specific certification in place as well, which is the ISO 20001. So after all this, you may be wondering slightly, if you don't have the ISO certificate or standard requested by the buyer, can you still bid for a public sector framework? So the first thing I would say is if it is it should always hopefully be clear in the tender documentation whether you can proceed. But if it's not clear, we would recommend always asking a clarification question. So you will find that some buyers within the ITT will state the commitment to ISO principles, and they'll name specific standards within the documents. But it may be unclear whether they're actually asking for evidence of the certificate. So yeah, definitely ask a CQ. So what is a CQ for anyone who doesn't know? A CQ is essentially just a question submitted to the buyer and the procurement team via the portal using the messaging function. So usually this is regarding sort of any aspect of the documentation you're unsure of or you need clarity on, and potentially highlighting any errors or issues in the documents as well. So definitely make use of the CQ function and read through the CQ logs, which will be made publicly visible to check whether sometimes the question you want to ask will already have been asked and answered. So the second point here is this is something you may be able to do if you don't hold the certificate. It's to commit to achieving certification by contract commencement. So some public sector tenders will offer a bit of leeway in terms of when you can actually provide the evidence of your certificate. So occasionally that's giving you a bit of time to just get that in place. But again, what I would always recommend doing is checking the documentation and checking the CQs and asking a question just to be sure that's acceptable and that's compliant as well. And then finally, another option, depending on how the ITT is set up, you may just have to answer further sections within the bid to provide more reassurance. So you'll often see this within selection questionnaires in the construction industry. They will just ask you to provide further guarantees and further responses to describe your processes if you don't have certain accreditations. So again, linking to our overall theme of let's say you're in a position where you can bid without the certification, but in that instance you need to provide sort of additional assurances around your methodology and the strength of your processes, for example. So in that situation, how would you go about writing the strong response that's aligned to the ISO standard without having the certificate in place? So if we take like a typical question that you might get on a construction or a works tender or any kind of public sector tender really, it's something like this. So please provide details of your quality management system, quality control processes, and how these will enhance the service delivery on this contract. So if you were looking to achieve a strong score on this question without having the certificate in place, this should be a reproach really. So the first thing to say would be, don't just ignore the ISO standard in the response. Acknowledge ISO 9001 as your guiding principle, and show awareness in the response of what the implications are for your business and for your industry. So you should obviously know what minimum standards your customers expect. So it's just pointing out how you meet those standards. And then the next point would just be to research. So find out what the ISO 9001 principles actually are as relevant to your business. And then as part of that, as the key bulk of your response, really, I would say, is going into the key elements that form part of your QMS, which meet the ISO standards. So as part of a response like this, I would imagine that to include internal KPI monitoring, stuff like how you performance manage your staff, how you supervise staff, how you handle complaints, how you resolve complaints, and how you continuously improve as a business. So on top of that, if you can, linking back to that evidence point again, if you can provide evidence of your QMS or something like a quality assurance policy or a procedure as an attachment, that would be a bonus. And then finally, if you can, and I'd say in these situations, the second best thing you can do if you don't have the certification is to outline your commitment within the response to eventually having that certificate in place. And if possible, state when you're planning to achieve this by, and actually give a date as well. So I'm going to hand over to QSL now to go through their section of the webinar.
Thanks, Adam. Nearly did the classic thing of unmuting then. Thanks very much. That was a really comprehensive, I think, insight into why ISO is important in bid writing. So thanks very much for that, Adam. Yes. I think from our part, so I'm Stacey Herman, I'm the Sales Marketing Manager here at ISO Quality Services. And we are an award-winning specialist organisation that specialises in helping SMEs implement ISO management standards into their organisations. Next slide, please, Adam. And for our part, we've got over 20 years experience in the ISO marketplace. We do specialise in implementing, maintaining and training businesses in the ISO standards. And we consider ourselves really a one-stop shop really for all your ISO needs. Adam quite nicely outlined there the main ISO standards. We consider those to be the core standards really, and those are the ones that we predominantly cover. We do have some, we do specialise in some industry specific standards that Adam mentioned as well. In fact, we are one of the UK's only providers of the 17100 standard, which is the translation standard. And there's also a couple of other specialist standards that we do. But as Adam mentioned, the core standards really are the foundations, and in particular, the 9001 quality management standard. I think that's the one that crops up most often on bid documents, and 42% of our clients have the 9001 standard really as the foundation standard. 44% of our clients have more than one standard. So it is very, very possible to have more than one standard. For ourselves, we have over 700 certificates out there, and we help clients in over 25 different countries. So we really can help businesses with all their ISO needs. Next slide, please, Adam. Fundamentally, our mission is to help make businesses better. So although we're here to talk about implementing ISO standards from a bid writing perspective, really we are here to talk about what makes your business better, whether that's for the purposes of a bid, but also going forward. Next slide, please, Adam. And Adam's very nicely, I think, summarised what ISO standards are, and really just to kind of emphasise that ISO standards are a seal of approval from a third party. it's demonstrating not only do you do what you say you do, but actually it's a third-party seal of approval to show that you do what you say you do. And actually, I think Adam summarised it really nicely. It's what great looks like. I thought that was a really good phrase there, Adam. Thank you for that. Next slide, please. Just another click. Thank you. So yeah, obviously we're here to talk about why do companies want ISO standards in place, and we really consider that having it for a contract or a tender writing purpose is the short-term benefits to the short-term reason why businesses would implement the ISO standard. And to be perfectly honest, that is the main reason why we get contacted by organisations. It is because they have a tender document on their desk and it's asking for an ISO standard. But as I said, fundamentally, we believe in helping make businesses better, and that there are a lot of long-term benefits to implementing the standards as well. And again, I think, Adam, you touched on these, and kind of just to reiterate really that there are many long-term benefits to implementing ISO standards, including improved employee retention. It can improve your customer satisfaction. The reason why many of you, I'm sure, are looking at getting into writing tendering for work is because you want to grow. So even if maybe you don't get that tender that you're going for right away, implementing an ISO standard can give you that ability to grow going forward. It offers protection for your business as well, and predominantly because it offers you organisational stability. So there are many long-term benefits to implementing an ISO standard, way beyond what your short-term reason for that might be. Next slide, please, Adam. So what do we do in terms of that process? So how can we actually help businesses implement those ISO standards? So for our part, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're a one-stop shop for all your ISO needs. We focus very much on the 5 core standards, as I've mentioned before, and I think Adam's gone in quite nicely into what some of those standards cover. So the 9001 is very much around your quality management side of things, and different tenders will obviously ask for different things. And as I mentioned earlier, it's quite usual for businesses to have maybe more than one standard. We can help businesses implement one at once, 2 at a time, whatever that tender is asking you for, we can assist you in relation to that. And our key aim really is to remove the stress from ISO implementation certification. We're realistic. We know that everybody here has a day job to do, and that implementing standards can be quite stressful. So our key message is that we try to make it simple and remove the stress away from implementing those standards for you. Next slide, please, Adam. The first port of call when you're looking to implement a standard is to establish really whether you need to go down the UCAS or non-UCAS route. This will very much depend on the wording of the tender document. And Adam, I noticed you had an example there, and it did actually have in brackets UCAS or other. So it is very dependent on the wording of the tender document as to which route you need to go down. Very often, if you are dealing in something like the defence sector, perhaps the aerospace, any kind of military contracts and things like that, they will often specifically require you to have UCAS accredited certification. On the whole, for the majority of businesses, straightforward certification is sufficient. And the main difference in terms of these 2 different routes is who is doing the certification. So with the UCAS route, you need to have a completely separate auditor coming in and actually awarding you the certification. With the straightforward certification route, you can have the same party implementing it and actually providing you with your certification. What I would say to any businesses is, if you're unsure, is to look at the wording of the document, look at the wording of the tender. If you're still unsure, by all means, come to us. We can have a look at that. Go to Adam and his team at Thornton Lowe. They will be able to take a look at it for you as well. And sometimes, even if it does say UCAS in the documentation, actually in those in those questions, you can push back in relation to that and just double check whether they actually require UCAS. We have had some clients in the past where they think that a tender requires them to have UCAS. We've suggested that they push back on that and just double check, and actually the tender writers have come back and said, actually, no, you don't. We just need it to be a third party audited management system, and what you have in place is absolutely sufficient. So always worth just double checking that to double check whether you need UCAS or non-UCAS. Next slide, please, Adam. The route to certification, as I said, our mission very much is to make it as simple and stress-free as possible for you. The starting point for any organisation that's looking to implement the standard is to have a conversation. Have a conversation with us or the provider of your choice. But for our part, we would have a conversation with you, work out what you've got in place already, establish what your needs are essentially, and establish where you're at already in the process. We would provide you with a proposal setting out very clearly what our costs are and what the ongoing costs in relation to that are. And we very much pride ourselves on holding your hand through the whole process. So we would support you through implementing any recommendations we make off the back of the initial assessment. We aim to get you certificated within 6 to 8 weeks of that initial assessment. And then we would provide you with ongoing support to help you maintain, train your staff in that standard, whatever that standard is that you've taken on board. Interestingly, I know, Adam, you mentioned about sometimes you will be required to provide evidence that you're already compliant with the standard, and sometimes you may be able to provide that evidence at a later date. What we can also provide is what we call a letter of intent. So if you are in the process of doing the tender, but you know that you don't have the ISO standard in place at the moment, once you have kind of come on board with us, we can provide a letter of intent, which sometimes is sufficient to at least get you through that first stage of the tender before you actually have your certification in place. And for anybody who just wants to find out a little bit more about the process and what's involved, we are always happy to have a non-obligation conversation with people just to find out, you know, what's involved, what the sort of timescales are, and how we can support you through that process, really. And as I said, going back to whether you require UCAS or not, we are a one-stop shop for your ISO needs. So even if you do find that you need to go down the UCAS route, we have really comprehensive consultancy services and training services that can help you get through that place, or get through that stage of your UCAS audit as well. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Stacey. That was great. So that's the end of the webinar itself. We will answer some of your questions now. It'll take about 10 minutes to do that. So I think Chris is going to sort of coordinate the Q&A, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks Stacey and Adam for that. That was really really insightful, a lot of value there as well, which hopefully people will get from that, so that's good. Just to reiterate for people that have joined a little bit later as well, there will be a fact sheet that goes out to everyone that's subscribed and got a ticket for this, and also a link to a recording of the session. So if you did join a little bit later on, then we've got you covered with that, and you hopefully shouldn't miss anything. So all good there. Right, if we just start then, let's have a look at the chat. Gareth mentioned, he actually messaged me directly, but I'll just mention it here. So Gareth's got 27001 shortly before it was updated to the 2022 version. So it's still valid for another 2 years. but are there many frameworks, or are there any reasons why additional frameworks require the later version, the 2022 version specifically?
I think it could just be that they're requiring the most up-to-date version, and that's what they consider as the compliant version of the certificate, I think. Yeah, but I would be, again, I'd link back to whatever framework or tender you're going for. It's just being clear with the buyer what they're actually looking for. And if it is uncertain, I would definitely ask clarification, but I think it might just be linked to the treating the most up-to-date version as the compliant version of the standard.
Great. Okay,
Yeah,
so it's
think,
Stacey, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, from my part, I would just make sure that you clarify with your current provider when they're looking to put you through that upgrade. So we've actually upgraded all of our clients already, even though the ISO organization doesn't require the businesses to be upgraded just yet. We've gone through that process with all of our clients already to make sure they are ready.
Perfect. No, that's great. And yeah, so I'd imagine, Gareth, if you just have a bit of dialogue with whoever's providing those tender documents and see whether that iteration is required or whether your current one is suffice. So moving on, Agna has asked, how can we highlight the benefits of having an ISO certificate in the quality questions to turn the bid into a winning bid? So I guess how do ISO certificates bolster your quality responses, Adam?
So in terms of the how aspect of that, I would say, again, sit down with the question in front of you, understand what question you're being asked. And then we always like to take the approach of storyboarding our questions. So that's essentially planning out the key points you need to that need to go into the response, and comparing that to what the buyer's evaluation criteria says in terms of how you achieve the best score. And then as part of that storyboarding process, what I would do is understand what the implications and benefits are of your holding that ISO for your customers. And then it's purely a case of just making sure you're flagging what those benefits are in the written content. If you are struggling, some people know what to say in their heads for a bid response, but they don't know how quite to get it down on paper. I'd say if you're struggling with that, just get in touch with us and we can help.
Brilliant, thanks. Next one is from Sarah. Is there an easy way to find out which certification services provide UCAS accredited certification? It's sometimes difficult to find this information, and is UCAS the standard for exemption-based questions? Bidders need to understand the implications of a non-UCAS certification for their bids.
Yeah, the short answer to is there an easy way to find out, then yes. So if you go onto the UCAS website, I believe they have a register of providers on the UCAS website. In terms of yeah, that's the easiest answer. Another way is that if you are looking for a UCAS provider but don't know where to go, we actually work with UCAS providers as well, because you know, we understand that some businesses require UCAS. It's as straightforward as that. So we actually do work with a couple of UCAS providers. So if people are looking for recommendations for a couple, then we work with a couple, more than happy to recommend them.
Great. Okay. And Sarah, if you want any more clarification or anything, you can either send me a message after the session or reply to the email that goes out, and I'll be able to get you some information from Stacey or from someone else. We can find that out for you. So next one is from Smither. They already hold ISO 9001, 27001, 22301, and 14001. Actually have those certifications from you guys, Stacey. But for bidding purposes, especially for public sectors, are the certifications for non-accredited providers equally recognised as UCAS accredited?
Yeah, the key thing to remember there is that the standards are all the same. So the standards that we implement are exactly the same as the standards that a UCAS organisation would implement. The key difference is who's doing the auditing. The question's not an easy one to answer because essentially it depends on the tender document. So I think going back to what I said in my presentation, you'd need to look at the specific wording of the tender. If it's unclear, then you would need to ask that in one of the questions to the tender writers and just ask the question. But essentially, the standard is exactly the same. There's no difference. We are implementing the same standards as a UCAS organisation.
Perfect. Thanks, Stacey. Next one up from Louise. How important do you consider ISO 27001 going forwards compared to, say, Cyber Essentials Plus?
I think ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials, they're kind of, there's a tendency for them to be used sort of interchangeably now on public sector bids. So many will say, please evidence your ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials.
Right.
So I think if you have the 27001 already, it's probably not a major concern if you don't have Cyber Essentials in terms of bidding. But that's not to say there wouldn't be benefits of gaining the Cyber Essentials certificate. And from what I understand, it's actually quite easy to get the Cyber Essentials certificate, I think.
Yeah,
so
I've
yeah.
heard similar, I think, from
I've
been doing, yeah. Great. I guess the final two questions now, if anyone else has any further questions, unless it's super quick, if you can respond to the emails that we send out after the session. But there are two final ones, which are pretty much the same kind of question. What are the typical lead times for gaining certification? And someone's asked whether it's the lead time for 27001, another for 45001 and 14001, whether it's any different for each.
So we aim to have all of our clients certificated within 6 to 8 weeks of their initial assessment. So regardless of the standard that you're implementing or whether you're implementing 1 or 2 standards at the same time, we aim to have all of our clients certificated within 6 to 8 weeks. Our lead times are currently, we're probably booking something in the region of a month to 8 weeks ahead for initial assessments at the moment. It varies depending on how busy we are, but currently that's where we're at.